Hi everyone, thanks for joining in. I'm excited to have Rebecca Stonehill joining me today. Hi Rebecca.
Hi, Jackie. Thank you so much for having me on. It's brilliant to be here.
So some of you might remember Rebecca was our author for the day a little while ago, so it's great to have you back talking to me.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I'm looking forward to it.
And a little bit about Rebecca. Rebecca lives in Norfolk in the UK and writes historical fiction, memoir, and poetry. She teaches creative writing to children and young people and is currently working on her fifth novel. She loves spending time in nature, wild swimming, and having adventures with her husband and three teenage children. And her latest book is The Secret Life of Alfred Nightingale. Hopefully, you can see my copy there, which I was very pleased to be reading and just finished reading it last night. So thanks for writing that and sending that to me to be able to read. Wondering if you want to start off by telling us a bit about The Secret Life of Alfred Nightingale.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, this book was published a little while ago now, back in 2017. But I grew up with a very adventurous mother who always used to tell me about her trips when she was in her early 20s. She did a lot of traveling. So this is back in the 1960s, and she did the hippie trail, she did the silk, she did loads of traveling, and I absolutely loved looking at all her photographs from that time. She did these beautiful albums, and one of my favorite things, this is the beauty of not having a phone in those days, one of the things that I did was I used to just pour through her photo albums, and there's little photos with the white edges around them, and I was just fascinated by them, and she wrote and everything, and just really beautiful albums. And there was one album I kept coming back to again and again and again, and that was her time that she spent in Matala, which is on the south coast of Crete, in 1967. And the reason I kept coming back to those pictures was because the setting was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was, she hitchhiked with some friends from Cambridge all the way down to Crete, which is no mean feat, but that was something that people did back then, especially they didn't have much money. And because she heard about these Neolithic caves in Matala that young people were drawn to and they were living in. And I kept looking at those photos and of them all standing outside these caves, and also pictures inside the caves. And there was even some really old pictures at the back of the wall. They were very ancient burial caves. And even as a child, when I love writing stories, I always thought I've got to set a story there, or I've got to set a book there at some point. So anyway, I wrote my first couple of novels, and I just kept coming back to this idea. But what I didn't want to do was I didn't want it to be my mother's story. I write fiction, and I didn't want it to be too informed by her stories from that place. So I decided to change the gender and to have a story about a young man. He's just 17 years of age. He's called Jim, and the story is about him and his journey down to Matala with a friend in 1967. And I also thought that I didn't want it just to be a coming of age story. I wanted there to be another layer to it. And the more I researched about Crete, and I realized that it was a very strategic place, a very important place during the Second World War for a huge battle that took place there, Battle of Crete. Many lives were lost, very traumatic site. And I had this idea, well, how can I don't want to give too much away actually for people that haven't read it yet, but I thought, how can I connect up the modern day element, which is the 67 element, with an older story? Jim, even though he comes across as being very confident and full of bravado, and he thinks he's a bit of a hit with the ladies, actually he has this deep insecurity, and he doesn't know why that is. And he has a terrible relationship with his father, and his mother's very repressed actually. And so that's one of the things he's also fleeing from, to go down to Crete. And so I link up, I start off in 1967 with this journey down, and it's not quite what he expects it's going to be. And then I also have this older element back in the Battle of Crete, and then these two stories linking up.
Mm. And I loved how you had the photos that you talked, like some of those photos you talked about at the back of the book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I for many years obviously had wanted to get to Matla, and I knew that I couldn't write a book without having visited it. But it wasn't until it it was about 8 years ago now that I managed to visit Matla. So I've got a photo of, well, at the back, there's a picture of my mother and her sister and her friend. You can see it here.
Yeah.
So that is, this is my mother outside the cave. So they used to string their washing up here. This is my auntie, my mum's sister, and then this is their friend Pam, who they went down with, who they're still very good friends with. And then you can just see it. There's my mother and her sister and Pam.
Yeah.
So that was in 2016. Yeah. So they keep going back, and
that's wonderful.
They are celebrities in Matala now, and to go and visit the caves of Crete, because obviously you can't sleep there now. It's turned into a tourist attraction. But that was another real pull for me, and I guess this is what's happened to a lot of these places, that back in those days there was nothing there. It was just this sweeping bay, really pretty horseshoe bay, with a shop selling bread and olives and basic supplies, yogurt, one or two tavernas, and that was it. And now it's a very, still pretty, of course, but it's a tourist resort. It's incredibly busy, but they've even set up a music festival once a year based around the hippies.
Oh, really?
So
yeah. And I was just looking at your cover again, and I didn't realize until now the little picture that's in the top in the head. I didn't realize that. You know, the photo, how the photo was in the, I only just realized it then.
Yeah, there it
is. That's pretty amazing.
I think that's kind of signifying secrets as well, because she's hidden, and all the layers unpeeling. As the years go back.
And what did your mother and auntie and her friend think about you writing this?
Oh, they loved it. They loved it, and they were so helpful. So there's, well, three of them in particular. So my mother and her two friends, Pam and Shirley, who are sisters. They were so helpful, and I spent literally hours talking to them, hearing all of their memories, and so many of their actual memories make it into the book. For example, there's one bit where they turn up at the caves, and someone says, "Oh, do you want a room with a bath?" And then they think it's really funny. Obviously, there's just really cartoons to lie in, but there was a real hierarchy about where you were sleeping, and the rooms at the top had the view, and like the rooms further down were a bit smelly, and so the longer you were there, the better rooms you got. But they were so delighted, and I feel like I dedicated this book to my mother, and she was a person who gave me my spirit of adventure and of longing to see the world. And the first time I went off backpacking when I was 18, I remember she sat there with me and she helped me put it all together. She said, "No, okay, you need to cut it down by half. You can't take that much with you." And so she's been really instrumental in the whole writing of this book, and I'm really happy to be able to dedicate this book to her.
And we've got a few people watching, so just wanted to remind those watching that if you do have a question or even a comment, if you want to let us know where you're watching from, for Rebecca, please type it and I can read it out. I've got a comment from Shirley. Maybe it's the Shirley you're talking about. She says Matala, she loved it and she loves your book.
Thanks, Shirley. I mean, I'm presuming this is Shirley as in Shirley, my mother's friend Shirley. I think that would be too big a coincidence otherwise. But yeah, Shirley has been very instrumental in writing this book. Shirley's also written her own incredible memoirs, also charting this time in the caves.
Oh,
She's
okay, yeah.
incredibly free-spirited, inspirational woman. So yeah, thank you,
Yeah,
Shirley.
yeah. And we mentioned you're writing your fifth book at the moment. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can tell you a very small bit, but only a small bit because it is really early stages, and you know how
Yeah.
it is when you're writing something, until you're quite ready. So yeah, this one is going to be very different. It's actually, I'm doing something that I haven't done before, and I'm writing a novel in verse.
Okay.
I have got a lot more into writing poetry recently. I still absolutely love writing prose. I think during the pandemic, when life was so strange and attention spans were short and there wasn't a lot of time very much in long chunks of time, I started reading more poetry because it was just, I could sit down and read a quick poem and then put it away. And so as a result of that, I started experimenting more with poetry. And yes, and I started reading a lot more novels in verse. And I thought, right, this is what I want to do. Something that has been very current for me for a long time, but particularly over the last few years, is just becoming increasingly aware of the climate and ecological emergency that we find ourselves in. And so I am now, with this book, I'm challenging myself to write something around this, but not in a very didactic way that, oh, you've got to do this, and this is what we need to do, and this is how we need to live, because obviously that completely turns readers off. So of course it's still character driven. My very vague idea at the moment is that I'm having four time frames. It's going to be quite a challenge for me, but I'm having somebody, so 4 different women in 4 different centuries.
Okay.
So the 19th century character is part of the anti-abolitionist movement. The 20th century character is part of the suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement. 21st century character is a climate activist. And then I'm going to have someone 100 years in the future.
Oh, wow.
Which I have not written anything like that before, but I'm really, I'm looking forward to it. And she's going to be rewilding land. But looking at it from the perspective that if we do enough now, what we do now matters in order to have this future which is free from the threat of climate breakdown and free from tyranny and great hardship. But that is kind of all based on the modern day character who's inspired by the previous characters doing enough so that future character can live that life that we all want to be able to live in 100 years time. But at the moment, things are very uncertain. So I'm trying to breathe life into the power of now, and what we do now will impact the future.
Wow, yeah, certainly sounds like it is could be an amazing book going through all that. And but certainly
I've just got to write it now. So there's like all these great ideas, but actually the nitty-gritty of now writing that book is going to be hugely challenging. But I'm also really excited about it. I think I've just been on a writing course, and someone was saying that when you feel really terrified about writing a book, actually that's the book you need to write. It's scary, it's really scary, and it feels overwhelming, but when you have that tension between terror and excitement, then actually that's the book that you need to write. So
and Kim says the new book sounds interesting. How challenging is it to maintain the story with the constraints of verse? That's a good question from Kim.
That's a really interesting question. Well, what I have found with my reading of novels in verse is that once you get into the flow of it, you absolutely forget you're reading in verse. You forget. And so it's really interesting, because what happened was I started writing it in prose with the modern day character, and it just kept stalling. It kept stopping, and I was feeling really frustrated, and I couldn't understand why. And so I just gave it a go, writing in verse, and suddenly, whoosh, it was like the floodgates opened.
Wow.
So for me as a writer, it's given me a huge freedom. Now what I've got to be careful with is that it's also appealing to the reader. But as I said, from if I do it well, that's obviously the challenge. From all the novels in verse that I've read over the last couple of years, you don't notice. I mean, I'll mention like one of my all-time favorite books, which I first read as a 21-year-old. It's called The Golden Gate by Vikram Seth, and who wrote A Suitable Boy, which is quite a famous book. And I think The Golden Gate is his first book, and it's not very well known. And I'm always astonished that more people don't know about it. It's set in Silicon Valley in the 1980s, and it follows the lives and loves of a group of 20-somethings, and that the whole book is in verse. And it starts off a bit like, oh, this is weird, but then by page 3, you're gone, you're away. The story powers you through, and there's a lovely energy and flow to it. So yeah, thank you for that really good question, and I really hope to be able to pull it off.
And
it is a departure for me, but exciting.
And Jessie wonders what kind of books you like reading, and I'm wondering if maybe there's something you might have read lately you could recommend to us. And Jessie also wonders if you like reading standalone books or series.
Thanks, Jessie, for those questions. I feel like whenever people say what kind of things do you like reading, I don't really have a very good answer, because I feel like I'm a real magpie. If I see a little flash of something, then I pick it up. I love all kinds of books. I do also find if someone mentions a book 3 times, or if I hear about a book from 3 different sources, then I see that as a sign like, right, okay, I need to read that book. So maybe that would be something. If I'm in a charity shop or a bookshop or a vintage shop, and I'm flicking through and I see something that appeals, then I'll read that. As far as standard series, I don't read series actually. Very, very. I mean, probably the last series I read was His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. So I did read all of those, which I love. But generally, I tend to read standalone books. There's a few things that I've really loved recently. So Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, which is set in a dystopian future, which I found really unsettling, particularly because, and she wrote this before the pandemic, but it's set all around a deadly virus suddenly descends, and life completely changes, and out of the ashes of this new world come a. Yeah, I mean, I think something like half of the population of the planet is wiped out, and it becomes a very troubling, unsettled world where you have to fight for survival. And it's about a group of traveling actors and musicians who are going around the settlements and performing. It was very unsettling, but incredible storytelling and world building. What did you say that
was called? Sorry, I missed.
That's called Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, and she's written a number of others, and I really want to read. Yeah, actually, so Jessie, another thing you were saying about series is, rather than reading series, if I like an author, then I'll read a number of their books. I'll do it that way rather than reading series. So that was fantastic. I also love classics. So I can't believe I left it this long to read Cider with Rosie by Laurie Lee, but I read that recently. That's set in, it's essentially a memoir, an account in a rural village in Gloucestershire in the west of England. And the language is so rich, and his memories are so rich of this of a world that has now gone. This is in the 1920s. I love that. It was so joyful and quirky and warm and beautiful. Like I am always looking for novels that are very well written. The story's got to be good, but I'm always looking for language. And people's ability and authors' ability with language. So if I'm at a bookshop, then I'll put it out and I'll read the first page. And if I'm not immediately grabbed by the way they write,
Yeah.
then I'll put it back. That's really important.
Yeah.
And another one I read recently is Writers and Lovers by Lily King,
Okay.
which is fabulous. If anyone has read Sally Rooney, Normal People, I would say it's a similar kind of genre. I thought that was very good as well, Normal People, but it's a similar genre. But it's one young woman kind of at the intersection, shedding that skin of being young. She's in her 30s. She's in that middle stage where she's about to go into the next stage of her life. She used to be a golf prodigy as a child, but she's turned her back on that. She has no money. She's living in this dingy little apartment in Boston. She's waitressing, but she's doing that because she wants to write a novel. She's always wanted to write a novel, and so she's spending all her time writing a novel. Life is really hard, but she's desperate to keep on to that creativity, that joy of wanting to do something creative that all her friends have long let go of, and she's desperate to keep it because she wants to be a writer. But then around the same time, she's also come out of a terrible relationship. But suddenly two men appear on the scene at the same time, and she falls madly in love with both of them. And so it's just how she navigates all these different kind of complicated threads, and she's a very intelligent and warm writer, and it doesn't feel cheesy. It just feels very generous to character. It's very character driven, and she's also a beautiful writer. And again, I haven't read any of others, but I definitely want to. So that's Lily King. I would really recommend her.
Yeah. No, thanks for those recommendations. They all sound great.
Do you have time for one more recommendation?
Oh, yes, of course.
At the moment,
we
just
always
quickly.
have time for
this is
recommendations.
called The Home Child by Liz Berry. Novel in verse. So that's also a bit of research for me of how people do it, and that's Liz Berry, and her great aunt was sent off from Birmingham to Canada about 100 years ago. So the home children, I didn't know anything about this. So apparently they think that 1 in 10 children in Canada are descended from home children, and they were children who sometimes orphaned, but mostly just incredibly poor and vulnerable, that the state didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to do with them. So they sent them on boats to be indentured laborers and domestic servants. And life was so hard for them. They didn't let them have. So the great aunt of this author left 2 brothers behind who were not allowed to have contact with her. I mean, it's really tragic. And maybe 10 years ago, the Prime Minister of this country gave a formal apology to the home children. But it's Eliza, this young girl's story of this trip, of going to Canada, and how hard life is for her when she reached there. It's very, very poignant, very beautiful, very well written. So I'd really recommend that.
Yeah, no, that sounds like an amazing read as well. And I'm really interested to know then, you've written about books set in different eras. You're writing a book that's going to have some in the future. If you could choose either to go back to a certain time or go forward to a certain amount of time, what would you choose and why?
Do you mean with my writing,
no,
or do you mean like
physically?
If
you physically could do that, where would you choose to go and why?
Oh, wow. What a question. That's a good question. I think I would love, so with my second novel, The Girl and the Sunbird, which is set in Nairobi, early colonial Nairobi, 1903, because we lived in Nairobi for 5 years, and Nairobi, in a very short space of time, we're really talking 100 years, has become this teeming metropolis. I would love to be Iris, and who's the character in this book, and go back to 1903 Nairobi, when it was a very small and sleepy township, and it was teeming with wild animals and birds. the house that we lived in Nairobi was one of the oldest houses in the area. It was an old wooden cottage, and we heard stories about how maybe just 50 years before, you would have elephants walking literally and lions past the veranda. I love nature. I love animals. The nature aspect for me in writing has always been really important. So if there's ever an opportunity to be surrounded by wildlife and nature, then I will take that. I completely fell in love with the bird life in Kenya and became very good at identifying all the birds. So I would go back to that time, and I would just absorb those amazing scenes before that new Nairobi came into being.
Yeah. No, that sounds amazing. And when you're writing, do you have a favourite place for writing?
I have a little room for writing, which was my husband's office, and I decided to kick him out because, and he very kindly agreed to that, because I this realization came to me, a bit silly, it didn't come to me before, but a couple of years ago, that I'm the only writer in my family, and yet somehow I was the only one without a desk. All my children in their rooms have their desks for their homework, and I was writing on the kitchen table, and with all the associations with that as well. I was having to sit down and get everyone's rubbish off the kitchen table before I was writing, and it suddenly occurred to me, as I said, I don't know why it didn't occur to me long before. I can't. This is crazy. I need my own space for writing, and so I said to my husband, "Can I have that study, please, for my writing?" Because there was somewhere else he could go, and very kindly he said, "Yes, absolutely." So it's a little room. It's got my board with all my inspiration on it. Loads of plants. It's a little bit like a greenhouse in there, because I absolutely love house plants. So it's very green. I normally have my 2 cats sitting on my bed or my lap or on the windowsill watching the birds go by. So that's where I write. But as for, it's just really convenient because I have my laptop and everything there. But I do absolutely love, if I have the opportunity, writing longhand in nature. So if that opportunity happens, then there's nothing like writing outside, in a forest, on a hillside, by the sea, just being really quiet and really tuning into nature. That's magical. I would, if I could, I would do that all the time. I live in a city though, so it's not possible. And of course, weather and all of those constraints. But whenever I'm writing like the first draft of a poem or a short story or some flash fiction, I always do that longhand, and I try and do that outside.
Well, you certainly sound like an outdoorsy sort of person, so I have to say I'm not surprised to hear that. Going back to what you talked about, the home children before, so Kim said that in Australia there were 4,000 young orphaned girls who came to Australia due to the Irish potato famine, and her great-great-grandmother was one of them.
Wow.
So that's pretty interesting as well.
You need to write that story.
Yeah, you do, Kim. You'll have to.
I mean, these stories need to be recorded, because they're just figures otherwise, aren't they? So Liz Berry says that it was 10,000 children between 1860 and 1960, and that's just a statistic. So Liz Berry's taken one of these. So you also, Kim, I'm sure you've already done some research on her, but I mean, how fascinating would that be to share her story for your family and for others, because I'm sure there's many other people, ancestors have been through the same thing, and it must have been such a tough life for them, incredibly tough.
Yeah, very interesting. Some of the things you can find out from history, and totally surprise you as well. But we do need to talk about these things.
Yeah, we do. We do. These children were really wronged. I mean, they say they would have been given a better life, but the records show, according to her research and probably yours as well, Kim, that the reality is quite different. I mean, essentially they were slaves, because
exactly,
they
yeah.
were not paid. Okay, they were given board and lodging, but they were treated really badly. They were shamed. They were made to feel morally, physically inferior in many ways. And it's really only now that this time has passed that people feel able to talk about it, and these stories are being dug up. And I think they're really important, these stories, and we need to share them and talk about them and write
Yeah,
about them and research them.
yeah. Yeah, so really encourage you, Kim. Kim said that she has found lots of really interesting ancestors and she'd really love to write about them all. So hopefully, Kim, we see you being author for the day one day.
Kim, watch this space. I'm looking forward to your story about it. Or what you can do is just, if I don't know if you do any writing, but just start off with a short poem or a short story, and just see where it goes. Join a writing group. I so firmly believe this, that we all have stories inside us. All of us have the potential as writers. I really don't. I don't know. There's something about people say, oh, you're either a writer or you're not, or you're born with that gene or you're not. And I really don't believe that. I feel like writing is a discipline, and writing is putting your bum on your seat and creating that discipline every day. But we can all do that. We all have that within us, and the more you practice, the better you get. So just really encourage anyone that doesn't write but wants to write is you can write. Everyone can write.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for talking to me. It's been great chatting to you, and thanks for those who joined in with some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it, Jackie, and thank you for your brilliant questions, everybody. And yeah, it's just been a great opportunity. It's been lovely to chat books.
And yeah, hope we have you back again when you've got a new book.
Thanks, Jackie. I would love that.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Take care.